The day my retirement savings disappeared, I realized I wasn't the one who had lost control. I had already given it away. I remember the exact moment because nothing felt dramatic about it at first. Just a quiet Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me as I logged into my account the way I had done for years. The same routine, the same careful habits that had carried me through decades of working, saving, planning for a future that was supposed to be stable, predictable, safe. But that morning the numbers didn't look right. Not wrong in a way that made you panic immediately, just off, like something had been moved slightly out of place when no one was looking, and I blinked, refreshed the page, adjusted my glasses, thinking maybe it was a delay. Maybe the system hadn't updated overnight. Maybe I had misread something. But the second time I looked, the truth didn't shift to accommodate me. It stayed exactly where it was, cold and unmovable. My balance was gone, not reduced, not adjusted, gone. As if the last 30 years of my life had been quietly erased without asking for permission. I didn't scream. I didn't even move right away. I just sat there staring at the screen while the sunlight came through the kitchen window in that soft, ordinary way, lighting up the same table where I had once helped my son with his homework, where I had written checks for his college tuition, where I had told myself over and over that everything I was building would one day protect me from exactly this kind of fear. And yet there I was, 68 years old, looking at a number that said 0, and feeling something deeper than panic settle into my chest, something quieter, heavier, the kind of realization that doesn't rush in but unfolds slowly, piece by piece, until you can't ignore it anymore. I told myself there had to be a mistake. Banks don't just lose money. Systems don't just fail like that. Not without warning, not without explanation. So I reached for the phone, my hand steady in a way that surprised me, and I called the number I had memorized years ago, listening to the automated voice guide me through options that suddenly felt meaningless, like I had stepped into a world where the rules I trusted no longer applied. When the representative finally answered, her tone was polite, professional, practiced, the kind of voice that reassures you everything is under control, and I gave her my information, answered her questions, waited while she reviewed the account, and there was a pause, just a small one, but long enough for something inside me to tighten. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "these withdrawals were authorized," and I felt the words land without fully understanding them. Authorized. As if I had willingly handed over everything I had worked for. As if I had signed away my own security without remembering it. I asked her to repeat herself, not because I hadn't heard her, but because I needed to hear it again, needed to see if the meaning would change the second time. But it didn't. She explained there had been multiple transactions over the past several months, gradual, deliberate, not the kind of activity that triggers alarms, not the kind that draws attention, and suddenly, the quiet morning didn't feel quiet anymore. It felt staged, like I had been sitting in the middle of something unfolding behind my back for far longer than I realized. I thanked her, because that's what I've always done, even when things don't make sense, even when something feels wrong. I thanked her and hung up the phone, and then I sat there again. The same kitchen, the same sunlight, but nothing about it felt familiar anymore, because the question that had been forming in the back of my mind finally stepped forward, clear and unavoidable. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't random. Someone had access. Someone had permission. Someone close enough to move quietly, carefully, without raising suspicion. And as I stared at the empty numbers on that screen, one thought settled in with a calm that scared me more than panic ever could. I knew exactly where I needed to look, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what I was going to find. I did not call my son right away because some truths feel heavier when they are spoken out loud, and I needed time to sit with the possibility that had already begun to take shape in my mind. I needed to make sure I was not letting fear guide me into something unfair, because Daniel had always been a good boy. That is what I told myself as. I walked slowly through my house, touching the back of a chair, straightening a picture frame, doing small, meaningless things just to keep my hands busy while my thoughts tried to catch up with reality. He was the kind of child who used to leave notes on the kitchen counter when he went to school, little scribbles that said things like, "Do not forget to eat lunch, Mom," or "I will be home early today." And I remembered those notes now with a clarity that almost felt cruel, because the man he had become was harder to read, quieter in ways I had once mistaken for maturity, more distant in ways I had explained away as responsibility. I had watched him build his life with Emily, watched them move into their first home, watched them talk about investments and future plans with a confidence that made me proud, and somewhere in all of that I had stepped back, believing that was what a good mother was supposed to do: give space, offer support, trust without asking too many questions. But, standing there in my living room with the echo of the bank representative's words still settling in my chest, I started to revisit moments I had ignored, small conversations that had not felt important at the time. Like the afternoon Emily had asked me if I still kept everything in one retirement account, her tone light, curious, as if she was simply making conversation over coffee, and I had answered without thinking. Because why would I not? She was family. She had smiled in that polite way. She always did, nodding as if filing the information away for later, and I had not thought about it again until now, or the time Daniel had offered to help me organize my paperwork, saying it would be easier for me if everything was digitized, safer, more efficient, and I had let him sit at this very table with my statements spread out in front of him, trusting his hands the same way I had trusted them when he was a child learning to tie his shoes. I remembered how confident he had seemed, how quickly he had moved through everything, assuring me that he would make sure I would not have to worry about anything as I got older. And I had believed him because I wanted to believe him, because it felt good to think that the boy I raised had grown into someone who would take care of me the way I had taken care of him. But now those memories did not feel warm anymore. They felt precise, deliberate, like pieces of something that had been quietly constructed while I stood in the middle of it unaware. I walked back into the kitchen and sat down at the table again, opening my laptop with slower, more careful movements this time. I did not rush. I did not panic. I simply began to look, transaction by transaction, date by date, and what I saw was not chaos. It was order, each withdrawal spaced out just enough to avoid attention, each transfer directed to an account I did not recognize, the pattern so clean, it almost felt respectful in its execution. And that was when something inside me shifted, not breaking, not collapsing, but settling into a kind of clarity I had not felt before. This was not an accident. This was not a stranger. This was someone who knew exactly how I lived, exactly how I thought, exactly how much I would notice and how long it would take me to question it. And as I traced those numbers with my eyes, following the path my money had taken away from me, I understood something I had never needed to consider before. Trust is not just something you give. It is something someone else can study, learn, and use. And whoever had done this had known me well enough to move through my life without leaving noise behind. And there are not many people in this world who know you that well unless you raise them yourself. I did not sleep that night, because once your mind begins to connect the pieces, it does not stop just because you close your eyes. It keeps working quietly in the dark, lining up memories you once trusted and placing them under a different kind of light. And by the time the sun came up, I was no longer asking myself if something was wrong. I was asking myself how long it had been happening right in front of me without me seeing it. I made breakfast the same way I always did. 2 eggs, toast, coffee, even though I barely touched any of it, because routine has a way of holding you together when everything else starts to slip. And as I stood there at the kitchen counter, I remembered the last Thanksgiving when Daniel and Emily had come over, how Emily had insisted on helping me in the kitchen, moving around with that same careful politeness she always showed, asking questions that felt harmless at the time, like whether I still received my statements by mail or online, whether I had ever considered consolidating my accounts, whether I trusted digital access more than paper records, and I had answered each one without hesitation, thinking she was just making conversation, thinking she was trying to include herself in my world. But now those questions did not feel casual anymore. They felt measured, like each one had a purpose I had not understood back then. And I remembered the way Daniel had stood nearby, not interrupting, not adding much, just listening. His expression neutral in a way I had once described as calm, but now recognized as something else entirely. Something more controlled, more intentional. I finished my coffee and went back to the table, opening my laptop again. This time not just to look, but to study. I wrote down dates, amounts, patterns. I traced everything as carefully as I had once balanced my checkbook. And the more I looked, the clearer it became that this had not been done in a rush. There were no large sudden withdrawals, no careless mistakes, just a steady movement over time, small enough to blend in, consistent enough to add up. and I could almost see the logic behind it, the patience, the understanding of how long it would take someone like me to notice. And that was when I realized something that settled deep in my chest. Whoever did this had not just accessed my account. They had anticipated my behavior. They knew I did not check every week. They knew I trusted the system. They knew I would assume everything was fine until it was not. And that kind of knowledge does not come from guessing. It comes from being close, from watching, from listening, from learning how someone lives day after day until you can predict them without asking. I closed the laptop slowly and looked around my kitchen again. The same cabinets, the same clock ticking softly on the wall, the same quiet house I had lived in for years, but it did not feel like mine in the same way anymore, because I could no longer separate the space from the realization that somewhere inside it, at some point, I had allowed the wrong person to understand me too well, and I thought about calling Daniel then, just to hear his voice, just to see if I could detect something different now that I knew what I was looking for. But I stopped myself, because there is a moment in situations like this when you understand that asking too early gives away more than it reveals, and I was not ready to show my hand yet. Not until I was certain, not until I could see the full shape of what had been done, because the truth, once spoken, cannot be taken back, and I needed to make sure that when I finally said something, it would not be a question, it would be a conclusion. The next morning I did something I had not done in years. I drove to the bank in person instead of calling or checking online, not because I needed more information, but because I needed to sit across from someone and hear the truth without the distance of a screen or a polite voice on the phone. The building looked exactly the same as it always had. Glass doors, clean floors, quiet conversations happening behind desks. A place designed to feel secure, predictable, trustworthy, and I walked in with the same calm expression I had worn my entire life. The kind people mistake for peace when it is really just control. I gave my name, my identification, and waited while the young man behind the desk pulled up my account, his fingers moving quickly over the keyboard, his tone friendly at first, routine, until it shifted slightly, just enough for me to notice. There have been several authorized transfers, he said, echoing what I had already heard, but this time I did not ask him to explain the amounts or the dates. I asked him something else, something much simpler. Who had access besides me? And for a moment he hesitated, not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood what the answer meant. He turned the screen slightly, enough for me to see without fully exposing it. And there it was, a name I already expected but still was not prepared to face in that context. Daniel Collins, listed clearly, cleanly, without emotion, as an authorized user, added months ago, and I felt something settle inside me. Not shock, not disbelief, but confirmation, the kind that removes all remaining doubt and replaces it with something colder, more precise. I nodded slowly, as if I had just been given a piece of information I could easily accept, as if this was a normal conversation about something small and manageable, and I thanked him. Because that is what I have always done. Even when the ground shifts beneath me, I thanked him and stood up, walking out of the bank with the same steady pace I had used walking in, but the air outside felt different, heavier, as if the world had quietly adjusted itself without asking me first. I sat in my car for a long moment without starting the engine, my hands resting on the steering wheel, and I let the silence fill in what words could not. Daniel did not just know about my accounts, he had been placed inside them, given permission, given trust, not taken it, not forced it, but received it. And that realization cut deeper than anything else, because it meant there had been a moment, a conversation, a decision, when I had said yes, when I had believed I was doing something responsible, something practical, something that would make things easier in the future. And now I was trying to remember exactly when that moment had happened, replaying conversations in my mind, searching for the point where caution had quietly turned into vulnerability. And then it came back to me, not as a dramatic scene, but as something small and ordinary. A Sunday afternoon, paperwork spread across the table, Daniel explaining that adding his name would make things simpler in case of emergencies, in case I ever needed help, in case something unexpected happened. And I had agreed because it sounded reasonable, because it sounded like care, because it sounded like the natural progression of a son looking out for his mother. And I had signed the paper without hesitation, without suspicion, without imagining that one day I would be sitting in my car outside a bank realizing that the protection I thought I was creating had quietly become the doorway someone used to walk away with everything I had spent a lifetime building. I started the engine finally, not with urgency, not with panic, but with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar, because the question was no longer whether I had been betrayed. The question now was how far it went, and whether Daniel had done this alone or if someone had been standing beside him, guiding him, shaping the decisions he might not have made on his own. And as I pulled out of the parking lot, one thought settled firmly into place. I was no longer looking for answers. I was preparing to face them. I did not go home right away because going back to the same walls without a plan felt like stepping into a place that no longer belonged to me. So instead I drove slowly through familiar streets, past the grocery store where I had shopped for years, past the park where I had once watched Daniel run across the grass with his shoelaces untied, laughing without a care in the world. And I let those memories come not to comfort me, but to measure the distance between who he had been and who he had become, because somewhere between those two versions of my son there had been a shift I did not see clearly enough, and I needed to understand it now, not emotionally but practically. I needed to see the pattern the same way I had seen the transactions, piece by piece. Without rushing to conclusions, I parked my car near the edge of the park and sat there watching people move through their ordinary lives, parents with children, couples walking side by side, and I realized how easy it is to believe in appearances, how simple it is to trust what looks normal when nothing is obviously wrong. Because that is exactly how this had been done, nothing loud, nothing careless. Just quiet decisions layered over time until the result became undeniable. I reached for my phone then, not to call Daniel, not yet, but to look back through messages, emails, anything that might show me where this began. And I found small things I had ignored before, a message from Emily asking if I had received a confirmation email from the bank, another from Daniel reminding me to check a document he had sent, things that had seemed helpful at the time, attentive even, but now felt coordinated, as if they had been guiding me gently towards something without ever making it obvious. I opened my email and searched for the word authorization, and there it was, an old message I had barely remembered, a document attached, signed electronically, my name at the bottom, his name added beside it, and I stared at it for a long moment, not because I did not recognize it, but because I finally understood it. This had not been done in secrecy, not entirely. It had been done in the open, wrapped in language that sounded responsible, necessary, logical, and I had accepted it because it aligned with the story I wanted to believe, that my son was helping me, that my family was looking out for me, that everything was moving in the direction it was supposed to. I closed the email and sat back, letting the weight of that realization settle fully. This was not a single moment of betrayal. It was a series of decisions, each one small enough to seem harmless, each one building on the last until there was nothing left to protect. And that meant something important. It meant that if I wanted to understand the full truth, I could not just confront the end result. I had to follow the entire path. I had to see every step they had taken and every step I had allowed, because only then would I know exactly what I was dealing with. I started the car again, and this time I drove home, but I did not go inside immediately. I sat in the driveway looking at the house I had lived in for so many years, the same windows, the same front door, everything unchanged on the outside. And yet I knew something inside me had shifted permanently. I was no longer moving through my life assuming everything was as it seemed. I was paying attention now, to details, to timing, to silence. Because silence, I was beginning to understand, is where the most important things happen. And as I finally stepped out of the car, one thought stayed with me, clear and steady. This was no longer about what they had done. It was about what I was going to do next. That evening I did something I had not done in a very long time. I prepared dinner as if I were expecting guests, even though I had not yet called Daniel, even though I had not said a single word about what I knew, because there is a difference between reacting and deciding, and I was not going to let this unfold as a reaction. I was going to choose how it happened. I set the table carefully, the same way I always had, placing the plates, aligning the silverware, pouring water into glasses that reflected the soft light above. Everything deliberate, everything controlled. Because control was the one thing I had quietly taken back the moment I understood the truth. And once everything was ready, I finally picked up my phone and called him, my voice steady, unchanged, asking if he and Emily wanted to come by for dinner. Nothing unusual, nothing that would raise suspicion, just a simple invitation from a mother to her son. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before agreeing, and that hesitation told me more than any answer could have. They arrived just after 6, Emily smiling the way she always did, polished, warm on the surface, while Daniel followed slightly behind her, his expression relaxed but his eyes moving just enough to take in the room, the table, me, as if he were measuring something without realizing it. We sat down, and for a while everything felt almost normal, small talk about work, about the weather, about things that no longer mattered in the same way they once had, and I listened more than I spoke, watching, noticing the rhythm between them, the way Emily would answer quickly when certain topics came up, the way Daniel would defer without making it obvious, small details that would have been invisible to me before, but now stood out with a clarity I could not ignore. And then, at the right moment, I asked a simple question, the kind that sounds casual but carries weight underneath. I asked Daniel how his investments were doing, and he answered easily at first, talking about markets, about opportunities, about growth, his tone confident, rehearsed in a way that made it clear this was a subject he had become very comfortable discussing, and I nodded, letting him continue, letting him build his own narrative, before I asked the next question, softer, almost absent-minded, whether he had ever considered using funds from other sources to support those investments. And that was when the shift happened, small but unmistakable. Emily's hand paused for just a second before she set her fork down. Daniel's answer slowed, his words choosing a different path, more careful now, less fluid. And I did not interrupt. I did not push. I simply let the silence stretch long enough for them to feel it, long enough for the weight of the moment to settle in the space between us, because silence, I had learned, can reveal more than questions ever could. And then I looked at him, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that came from knowing exactly what I was about to say, and I told him I had visited the bank that morning. I told him I had reviewed every transaction, every authorization, every detail, and I watched his face as the meaning of those words reached him, not all at once, but gradually, like a realization he had been avoiding finally catching up. Emily spoke first. Of course she did, her voice smooth, controlled, offering explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface, talking about helping, about managing things more efficiently, about making sure everything was working in my best interest. But I did not look at her. I kept my eyes on Daniel, because this was not about her voice. It was about his silence, and in that silence I saw the truth more clearly than any words could have given me. He knew. He had always known. And as the room grew quieter, as the explanations became thinner, I felt something settle into place inside me. Not anger, not grief, but certainty. The kind that does not need to be spoken loudly to be understood. And when I finally spoke again, my voice did not change. It did not rise or fall. It remained exactly as it had been from the beginning, steady, controlled, and impossible to ignore. Daniel did not look at me right away, and that was the first honest thing he had done all evening, because avoidance, when it finally breaks through the surface, tells the truth more clearly than any confession ever could. Emily was still speaking, still filling the space with explanations that sounded carefully constructed, words like help and efficiency and protection woven together into something that almost resembled concern. But there was a thinness to it now, a lack of weight that made it impossible to take seriously once. You knew what was underneath. I let her finish without interrupting, because there is no value in stopping someone who is revealing more than they realize. And when she finally fell silent, I shifted my attention back to Daniel, and I said his name the same way I had when he was a child, calm, steady, without urgency, and he looked up then, slowly, as if meeting my eyes required more effort than he had expected. And for a moment I saw something familiar there, not innocence, not regret exactly, but something closer to recognition, as if he understood that whatever distance he had placed between us no longer existed, that we were now standing in the same place, looking at the same truth, whether he wanted to or not. I asked him a question, not because I needed the answer, but because I wanted to hear how he would choose to respond now that silence was no longer an option. I asked him how long it had been happening, and he hesitated, not long, but long enough to show that he was deciding what version of the truth he was willing to offer. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, less certain. He said it started small, just a few transfers, just temporary, just something they intended to manage and replace later. And I listened, not to the words themselves, but to the structure of them. The way each sentence tried to soften what had already been done. The way each explanation leaned on intention instead of outcome. As if the purpose behind an action could somehow erase its effect. Emily stepped in again. Of course she did, adding details, reinforcing the narrative, speaking about opportunities they did not want to miss, about how the money was not being wasted but invested, about how everything was meant to benefit all of us in the long run. And I realized then that this was not a moment they had feared as much as I had imagined. It was something they had prepared for, something they had discussed, perhaps even rehearsed in quieter conversations long before this dinner ever happened. And that realization did not make me angry. It clarified something much more important. This was not a mistake. This was a decision, repeated over time, supported by reasoning they had convinced themselves was valid, and I let that understanding settle before I spoke again. Because once you see something clearly, there is no need to rush your response. I told them I was not confused. I told them I understood exactly what had been done, every transfer, every authorization, every step. And I watched as that certainty shifted the room in a way their explanations never could, because confidence, when it is quiet and grounded in truth, removes the space where denial can exist. Daniel leaned back slightly, his shoulders tightening in a way that suggested the conversation was no longer under his control, and for the first time since they arrived, Emily did not immediately fill the silence. And in that pause, I saw something that had not been visible before, not fear exactly, but awareness, the realization that whatever role they believed I would play in this situation was no longer available to them. I was not going to argue. I was not going to plead. I was not going to react in a way that gave them room to guide the outcome. And as I sat there, looking at the two of them across the table, I understood something with complete clarity. They had built their plan on the assumption that I would remain who I had always been, trusting, accommodating, willing to accept explanations that preserved the idea of family. But that assumption, like everything else they had taken from me, no longer belonged to them. I did not raise my voice, and I did not ask them to leave, because power does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sits quietly at the table and lets the truth settle until there is nothing left to argue with. I folded my hands gently in front of me and let the silence stretch just long enough for them to feel the absence of control they once had. And then I told them something simple, something that did not sound dramatic, but carried more weight than anything else I could have said. I told them I had already taken steps that morning. Daniel's eyes shifted again at that, not in panic, but in calculation, trying to understand what I meant, trying to measure how much I knew and how far I had gone. Emily leaned forward slightly, her voice returning to that careful tone, asking what steps, as if this were still a conversation she could manage. And I answered her without hesitation. I told them I had removed all access from my accounts, every authorization, every shared permission, everything that had once allowed them to move quietly through my life without resistance. And I watched as that information settled into them, not with shock, but with the slow realization that something had changed in a way they could not reverse with words. Daniel opened his mouth as if to respond, perhaps to explain, perhaps to reassure. But I did not give him the space. Not this time. I continued, calmly, clearly, telling them I had also documented every transaction, every transfer, every date and amount, not because I needed to confront them with evidence, but because I understood now that clarity is not something you ask for. It is something you establish, and I had done exactly that. The room felt different then, not tense, not loud, but quieter in a way that made everything more visible, the expressions they could no longer hide. The small shifts in posture that revealed more than their words ever had. Emily sat back, her confidence adjusting, recalibrating, and Daniel finally looked at me directly again. And this time there was no avoidance, no attempt to soften what had already been exposed, just a recognition that the position they thought they held was no longer theirs. I did not accuse them. I did not list their actions or demand explanations, because none of that would change what had already happened. Instead, I told them something else. Something I had only just fully understood myself. I told them that trust is not lost in a single moment. It is given away in many small ones, and that I had been generous with mine, more generous than I should have been. And for a brief moment, I saw something flicker in Daniel's expression, something that might have been regret, or perhaps just the realization that the story he had been telling himself about what he had done no longer held up in the presence of someone who could see it clearly. Emily did not speak this time, and that silence from her was louder than any explanation she had offered before, because it meant she understood there was no version of this conversation she could reshape to her advantage anymore. And I let that settle before I said the final thing that needed to be said, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. I told them that whatever they had planned for the future, whatever assumptions they had made about how this would unfold, needed to be reconsidered, because I was no longer operating within the version of reality they had created. I was operating within the truth, and the truth, once acknowledged, changes everything. I stood up then, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet control I had maintained from the beginning. And as I began to clear the table, I understood something with absolute certainty. This was not the end of what had happened. It was the beginning of what I was going to do about it. They did not stay long after that, not because I asked them to leave, but because there was nothing left in that room for them to control, no space to reshape the conversation, no opportunity to guide the outcome in their favor. And as I watched them gather their things, moving more quietly than when they had arrived, I realized something I had not allowed myself to see before. They were not leaving out of anger or defiance. They were leaving because they understood, even if they did not say it, that the version of me they had relied on was no longer there. The door closed behind them with a soft, ordinary sound, and the house fell into a silence that felt different from before, not empty, not hollow, but settled, like something that had been shifting beneath the surface had finally come to rest. I stood there for a moment, listening to that silence, letting it fill the space where confusion and doubt had once been. And then I returned to the table, not to clean it immediately, but to sit down again, the same place where everything had unfolded. And I looked at the small details I had overlooked before, the placement of the plates, the glasses, the faint reflection of light on the surface, all the ordinary things that had once defined my sense of home. And I understood that none of those things had actually changed. What had changed was my understanding of the people I had allowed into that space. And that realization did not break me the way I might have expected. It clarified me. It sharpened something inside me that had been softened by years of trust, by years of believing that family meant safety, that closeness meant loyalty, that giving meant receiving the same in return. I reached for my phone then, not to call Daniel, not to revisit the conversation, but to follow through on what I had already set in motion. I contacted my attorney, the same one who had helped me years ago with estate planning, and I spoke with a calm I did not have to force, explaining what had happened, outlining the steps I had already taken. And as I spoke, I realized how different it felt to describe the situation without emotion attached to it. Just facts, just actions, just consequences. And that difference mattered, because it meant I was no longer reacting. I was deciding. We discussed options, legal boundaries, the process of recovering what could be recovered, the steps required to ensure nothing like this could happen again. And I listened carefully, asking questions when necessary, making notes not just on paper but in my mind. Because this was not just about resolving a situation, it was about redefining how I would move forward from this point on. After the call ended, I sat there for a while longer, not thinking about Daniel as my son in the way I once had, but as someone whose actions now had to be understood within a different framework, one that did not rely on assumptions or history, one that relied only on what was true in front of me. And that shift, as difficult as it might sound, did not feel like a loss. It felt like alignment, like seeing something clearly for the first time after years of looking at it through a softer lens. I finally stood up and began to clear the table, each movement steady, each action deliberate, the same routine I had followed for decades, but now carried by a different understanding. And as I placed the last dish in the sink and turned off the light above the table, one thought remained, simple and unshakable. They believed they knew me because they had been close to me, but they had mistaken familiarity for understanding, and in doing so, they had overlooked the one thing that mattered most. I had been paying attention all along. I just chose the moment to act.